Okay. All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I'm in West Africa, so it's past 12 noon here. So welcome to this AVMI vaccine manufacturing webinar. We're very glad that we are colleagues from CDC and PathChai. Some of them are consultants have agreed to share the findings from this piece of work on how the landscape for African vaccine manufacturing looks like. My name is William Ampofo. I'm the Executive Director for the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. These are some of the activities that we arrange for our members, and we encourage our members to be fully signed up so that they can continue to participate in such forum, which will move us towards sustainable vaccine manufacturing on the continent. We have Farah, our chair, who is also here. Farah, welcome. And I'll go straight and hand us over to Wesley Rono from the Africa CDC to introduce the study and our speakers and get us going. Thank you very much. Over to you, Wesley. Wesley, you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. So yeah, so I was saying thank you very much, Prof. And also I just want to say happy to meet all the colleagues here, and that my role is really very simple, to introduce the colleagues who are going to do the presentation here. But just to say that looking back, I think in March when we started this exercise, I think we also had a session with AVMI before kicking off. And we had one-on-one sessions, as you all know, with yourselves. So today we have colleagues here, Kris and Phil, are going to present the product of this work, which going forward, it will inform not only yourselves as manufacturers, but also other partners, be it member states, Africa CDC, DFIs. It's a rich source of information, and it will inform the strategic direction that African-made vaccines landscape will be taking going forward. So I think there was one slide which I was supposed to show, if I'm not wrong. Yes. So maybe just before I go through this slide, so we have Phil from Chai, who will be leading the presentation as well, and Kris, independent consultant, but quite a number of you know him as well, very well known within these cycles, will also be making the presentations. So I mean, just very briefly, is that this work consolidates the findings and provides key updates for the supply landscape within the continent. It also tracks progress on some of the key issues within the manufacturing ecosystem, and then it makes recommendations on areas and priority actions that needs to be taken, both within at continental level, Africa CDC, but also at member states level, and also potential information to manufacturers that will inform their decision-making processes. So without taking a longer time, I will now hand it over back to you, Prof, and then maybe you then welcome our key speakers for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wesley. I think our key speakers, Kris, as you mentioned, is quite well known to several of us, to almost all of us. He's worked extensively in the African vaccine manufacturing the continent for several years now. And Phil, you're also welcome. We're very happy to have you working with Kris to tell us what you found. So over to you guys. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. And yeah, I'll very quickly just outline what we've looked at through the course of this study, and then we can take you through the details. But in this work, we looked at 6 factors which are key for the success of any manufacturer, but also for African vaccine manufacturers. So these are technical capabilities, workforce, access to products, financing, regulatory approval, and demand and procurement. Obviously, some of these sit within the control of manufacturers themselves, particularly technical capabilities, as well as workforce and access to products to some degree, and some outside. So over the course of this work, And building on what we did last year, where we spoke to all of you then and presented some results about the state of manufacturing across the continent. Here we've done the same thing and then looked to build on that by also speaking to finance institutions to understand what financing is available for manufacturers and what the gaps are that we found there. On the regulatory approval side, to understand what the regulatory standards are across the continent and the key requirements for manufacturers to get the approvals needed to access these markets. And on demand and procurement, to understand if there is sufficient demand for African-made vaccines necessary to support the commercial viability of manufacturing. So of those 6, we've covered 5. Workforce was not in the scope of this, but we'll look to go through these factors across the course of the presentation. And I'll hand over to Kris to take us through the first 2 of those factors, the technical capabilities and the access to products. So yeah, Kris, over to you.
All right, thanks, Phil. Greetings from cold Northern Ireland. I guess next slide, please. So since last year, we have a bit of an update in terms of where we stand on the continent in terms of manufacturers. So as of June of this year, we had 25 active vaccine manufacturing projects in Africa, and we separated them into 3 different segments. And I know sometimes people wonder why they're not in one segment versus the other, but I wanted to pause here and give a little bit of an explanation of what the different segments are. So the 5 suppliers in segment 1, they are the companies who already have commercial scale vaccine manufacturing facilities, but also tech transfers that are underway or complete. So the ones in the second segment are ones who have commercial scale facilities and are ready to receive or start tech transfers, but haven't yet. Whereas the remaining 15 in segment 3 are those who are still working on both of those at the same time. So it's not to say that anybody's further behind or there's any great difference other than just segmenting country or manufacturers along those terms. One thing that does become very apparent when we look at all the different manufacturers, though, is that understanding and rationalizing the number of projects is something that's important, because we all can probably attest to the fact that we can't sustain 25 different projects on the continent. And then lastly, there are a number of different suppliers who are looking to do drug substance capacity, which is a great thing, and one thing that we'll talk about a little bit later, because drug substance is not only a key to being able to be sustainable manufacturers on the continent, but also something that we still lack. The next slide. So we'll take our first stop here at drug product, and just showing here that if we look at our need or demand of total vaccine demand in 2030 for the African continent, we have about 1.3 billion doses of demand for vaccines across the entire continent. However, currently, we already have 1.4 billion doses of drug product capacity already installed or ordered, and that comes from segment 1 and segment 2 suppliers. So just to say there that we actually already have more capacity than we will need totally on the continent in 2030. If we look to the bar graph to the right, we have a similar situation for emergency operations. If we were to need to respond to a pandemic and we had a greater amount of capacity needed to hit all the demand that would be generated there, but that we expanded how many shifts we would run every week in a facility and running 24/7, we see that we would also be able to more or less hit that capacity as well. So needless to say, we have already exceeded not only our future demand, but also the African Union's target of 60% of products on the continent already for drug product. However, what we will see later is that we do not have this same level of coverage for drug substance. The other thing to keep in mind here is that this actually represents about a 40% reduction from last year's assessment, and that mostly has to do to two things. The first one is greater clarity around what products could be produced or will be produced in some of these facilities. So as you can see on these charts, we have whiskers. The top whisker is what would happen or what capacity would be if we produced everything in 5-dose vials. And at the bottom whisker, we have if we only produced everything in 1-dose vials. And the colored section of the bar is what happens at a 5-dose vial presentation. So as you can imagine, knowing what products you're going to make, what presentation they're going to be in is going to have a big impact on your production output and therefore capacity that you can achieve. So, but yes, I think the other thing, which we'll discuss a little bit in a few slides, is that overall our drug product capacity will continue to increase if we continue to build facilities, and that may cause some issues for longevity for some of the projects. Next slide. So as alluded to in the previous slide, our drug substance capacity is still below where most of us believe we would need to be. So currently we have about 61 million doses of installed drug substance capacity at 3 different manufacturers. Again, this excludes people who have manufacturing facilities for drug substance but are product agnostic, because it becomes almost impossible to try and talk about what output in terms of doses those facilities can have until a product is assigned. So that's also one difference from last year's presentation. But as we can see, most of the installed capacity that we have is actually in mRNA drug substance capacity. And in many cases, those products, or I guess in this case, we're still finalizing what products those could be for, or that capacity could be used for. Again, we mentioned that other manufacturers have plans for drug substance, but the timelines and product candidates still remain unclear. So therefore, they're not included here, but they are clearly, or most certainly, not forgotten. And lastly, just to point out again that, you know, this is roughly only 10% of the 2030 African demand that we will have for all vaccines on the continent. So, you know, this clearly falls short of not only the African Union 60% target, but just in general, having, you know, overcapacity for drug substance or drug product and undercapacity for drug substance is a imbalance that will probably need to be rectified over time. Next slide. So this is the first of two slides we have on kind of tracking the different tech transfers that are being discussed or in the works on the continent. So on the right-hand side, we have where the breakdown of the segment 1 manufacturers are in terms of their tech transfer process or progress. So since last year, we've had 5 new tech transfers started and 2 more being signed. However, if you compare our slides to last year's slides, you'll see that instead of having 5 commercial or 5 vaccines in commercial production, we now only have 3. So we've lost 3, which are just, you know, COVID and other products which are just not being pursued for commercial production anymore on the continent. The other thing that you'll see is on the left-hand side, we have a very, very large number of what we're calling pre-deal talks. So this is before a tech transfer is signed. So it could be everything from a conversation that's being held by 2 manufacturers to even MOUs, especially when they're non-binding. The way that we've calculated these are just based on when a tech transfer deal, you know, supply deal, a quality agreement have been executed. That's kind of what we're saying is the falls into the segment 1 list here. I think the other thing that is brought out in this slide, which is another way of cutting up all of that data, is that it shows that we actually have a good breadth of conversation and MOUs and different progress being made across many of the different antigens on the continent. But we see in some cases, like with HPV, IPV, that we have quite a number of, I guess, a number of different deals that are in the works here, which could lead to overfragmentation of the market on the continent in particular. So just something to be mindful of as people are carrying out and progressing their tech transfer deal conversations. Next slide. And then lastly, I know this is a slide most of you have probably seen in the past, but it's just a reiteration of the 8 antigens that we expect to achieve WHO pre-qualification and actually enter into the continental market between now and 2030. So, you know, we do have a good cohort of products that are coming to market with pretty strong numbers in terms of African demand. And a lot of that capacity or a lot of that procurement is actually currently going through UNICEF. So I think these 8 products, at least in the short term, are a focus of a lot of the efforts on the continent. And I think Phil will talk us through some of the more details around the demand for these products. So over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Kris. So yeah, having gone through the technicalities and the products, these are additional sections which we did this year, which were not included in the research last year. But first, just to touch on financing. So we've spoken to a number of DFIs as well as to AVM specifically around the financing needs and the financing that is available on the market. And we found 5 key factors that have posed challenges for AVMs in accessing, in filling their funding requirements. Firstly, we found an issue around coordination. So while there are finance institutions out there, as well as donors who are targeting giving funding to African manufacturers, there tends to be quite limited coordination between the two, and that can create difficulty in each of the sets of conversations where some linkage would help have a complete picture of the market, of the manufacturer and their financing requirements. We also found an issue around risk appetite, where DFIs typically avoid higher risk projects, particularly around R&D, while focusing on lower risk in infrastructure projects, which is where their expertise lie. So this can mean that whilst there is a lot of funding available for building a new facility, steps like tech transfer and R&D and regulatory, there's gaps there, and that poses a risk to the commercial viability of the manufacturer. Linked to that is this issue around ticket size, where DFIs are set up to generally deal with larger ticket size items, you know, in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. But there remains a need for smaller financing within AVMs for things like working capital, as well as these other steps like tech transfer and R&D. And so that remains a gap which is yet to be filled for many manufacturers. We also heard about deal terms, that the deal tenor and the repayment terms are not always aligned with the commercial timelines for AVMs. We've heard that DFIs are generally set up to give loans out for something like 8 to 10 years, which if you're developing a DS project is not a timeline in which repayment is feasible. So there's a requirement for more patient repayment terms, as well as access to equity. Given that a lot of manufacturers are relatively young and maybe have a limited balance sheet, that there's limited new sources of equity funding, which then limits the ability to raise debt, and again kind of excludes manufacturers from the standard DFI processes. So these were the kind of 5 areas that we identified, and the impact of this has been that high potential projects that we've identified in segment 1 and segment 2 continue to have financing gaps, and whilst there continues to be funding availability for new greenfield projects, kind of the success of some projects which are already significantly developed rely on some additional funding to fill the gaps on R&D and tech transfer. We then also looked at regulatory, and I'm sure a lot of this will be familiar. But as we know, currently the only countries with ML3 for vaccines producing are Egypt and South Africa. And that is the standard which is required in order to achieve WHO PQ, which, as Kris mentioned, is the market for 90% of the vaccines procured across the continent, and so is a key market for all manufacturers. So the other segment 1 and segment 2 suppliers we've mapped out across the continent, as well as the regulatory status of those countries. So we know that Ghana is ML3 for medicines and vaccines, but not producing, but there is support there to support the development of that regulatory body. In Morocco and in Senegal, those regulatory bodies are ML1 and ML2, but again, significant funding and support has been received from multiple partners like USAID, BMGF, and the Team Europe to support the development of those bodies. So regulatory standards are there in South Africa and Egypt, but remain a gap in some other countries. Linked to this is the PQ process, which is obviously a requirement to access the UNICEF market. And so here we've just mapped out the process of getting PQ for a manufacturer application. And there's obviously two wings to this. One is the dossier, which will be screened and then assessed over the period of 300 days, or that's the target, over 300 days. Whilst the manufacturing site inspection is a parallel process, with first actions taking 210 days. In our discussions on regulatory with WHO and other key partners here, a lot of the emphasis came on the delays that have been seen in applications historically, including for vaccines, has been in actioning any amendments that are required in the dossier assessment or in the manufacturer site's inspection. So it's essential that kind of support is there for manufacturers to get the dossiers up to standard before submission, and also to respond rapidly to any of these assessment findings, so that PQ can be achieved quickly and the timelines that we've heard from manufacturers can be achieved. And then finally, on the demand side, so here, we looked to try and identify what hypothetical demand offtake could be around the year 2030 for the antigens which we know are coming to market in that time span. Obviously, we can't model exactly what that demand would be, but this is kind of a best case scenario using a set of assumptions, which I'll run through now. So we looked at the 8 near to market antigens, which Kris showed. So these are ones where there are tech transfers underway with manufacturers with facilities in place. We then did a market sizing, kind of using global UNICEF markets, and then looking at African bilateral markets based off Linksbridge data for 2030 with some additional adaptations based on our market understanding. And then for the hypothetical market assessment, we based it on the current procurement system, so through Gavi and UNICEF, and didn't consider an APPM. We consider there'd be no delays in the manufacturer time to market that was mentioned when we spoke to manufacturers, and that these products would come to market at a globally competitive price. We used kind of rough guesses of UNICEF tender allocation considerations. So for new manufacturers, that is rarely above 30% of a tender will be allocated to a new manufacturer. And UNICEF rarely awards kind of 100% of a manufacturer's capacity. They leave significant buffer room there. So we took those into consideration as well. And then for products where there's a choice, like for PCV, we maintained the current kind of programmatic alignment to understand country uptake there. Just to note, this doesn't include kind of tender timelines or scale up, as that gets quite complicated. So that's what we use to get to a kind of market demand assessment. Our findings were this, that if we look at kind of global UNICEF demand, it's around 2.6 billion doses a year. 300 million of that is kind of commoditized vaccines. So here given that there's no AVMI support and they're currently produced at a very low price, we thought it'd be a challenge for AVMs to compete at a competitive price there, and so didn't identify any market opportunities there. For the 8 products coming to market by 2030, using the assumptions that I went through, we found a total market opportunity of around 150 million doses. And the limitation here is really, market competition, given that there's already, in many cases, 3 to 4 existing global manufacturers in the UNICEF market. Outside of these markets, the opportunity is relatively limited. We looked at additional markets which AVMs could look to enter, and some of these numbers will grow. I should say that this is UNICEF data for 2023. So, for instance, malaria is here, but that number will grow. But for markets like malaria or HPV or TCV, there could be, and RSV as well, there could be significant growth, but at the moment, we estimated that about 20 million. And again, here, market opportunities are relatively limited. And on top of that, the novel vaccines, may present a significant opportunity for AVMs, but the market size there remains unknown. Looking at bilateral procurement, we identified, quite a significant share of this market, so around a third, where the near-to-market antigens could hypothetically address kind of 50 million demand there. So across the board, that's using those assumptions and use it and working it through. This is where we got to with demand. And I mean, just to put it in context, so we have this kind of total installed capacity of 1.4 billion doses using 5-dose vials. Looking at the manufacturers with tech transfers underway, that's about 1 billion doses. But then looking at the demand that we've identified, there's the 150 from UNICEF, the 50 from bilateral, and then this novel vaccines plus the unaddressed market for a further 50. So there's a significant risk of overcapacitation and a need to, first of all, kind of shore up this hypothetical demand so that we can realize that in the year 2030, but also to build on it so that we can find uses for the capacity that has already been constructed. So those are our findings, and then I'll just touch briefly on kind of the next steps here. So as we discussed in kind of conversation when we were doing the data gathering exercises, this has been shared with global partners, particularly UNICEF, Gavi, WHO, and BMGF, as well as the partners involved in the research like Africa CDC, TRI, and PATH. And so we are seeking to kind of unify activities around 6 priority actions to address the challenges for commercializing African manufactured vaccines at the moment. So firstly, on demand and procurement. So I've run through the demand, but a lot of that remains uncertain, and there's a need to kind of secure demand for African-made vaccines. And the priority actions here are firstly, for countries to clearly signal demand for African-made vaccines, and to incorporate African-made vaccines into procurement processes. Secondly, global procurement stakeholders need to ensure procurement practices facilitate African manufacturers' route to market, and communicate how to achieve that and a clear path forward there. Just to mention, this is an area that, in terms of country engagement, CHI, Gavi, and Africa CDC are engaging with countries at the moment to gather more data around this and we'll be reporting back on that at the forum in Q1 next year. In terms of regulatory approvals, there's a risk here of longer timelines to market if there's any delays in the PQ process. So here there's actions required to ensure that the dossiers that are submitted are complete and can be approved quickly. And so that requires kind of an action for AVMs to ensure that it's up to standard and for support to be provided in order to assist in doing that. And then and that address one issue of going through the PQ process. The other is this point about having ML3 status in the countries where it's needed. And so there's an action for countries to upgrade their maturity level, and for partner support to be made available, as it already is in some places like Morocco and Senegal, but to ensure that regulatory standards don't pose an issue for manufacturers coming to market. And finally, on the funding challenges, so as I said, there remains funding gaps for near-to-market vaccines and for high potential projects, but there remains kind of funding being allocated to new greenfield projects, despite kind of overcapacitation already being the current status. So here, funders need to develop risk-appropriate financial instruments that can close the gaps around tech transfer and technical assistance. And here too, CHAI is working with DFIs and will be coming back with a series of recommendations on how risk-appropriate financial instruments can be designed to support African manufacturers. And finally, I think there's a need to strategically evaluate all new projects to determine realistic commercial opportunities before investing funding into new projects. Given the overcapacity of drug product that we see and the limited demand that I ran through, I think we see a limited opportunity for new greenfield projects, and there's a need for kind of partners to evaluate further actions, but before developing that further. So those are the priority actions. Maybe I'll pause here, and before we go to questions, I'll ask if Wesley or Kris have anything to add as well.
Nothing from me.
So I see Farah has raised her hand. So Farah, go ahead and ask your question.
I think you were going to ask Wesley and Kris if they wanted to add anything first. I was just getting into the queue of one.
Okay, because Kris said he had nothing to add. Wesley, do you have something else to add?
No, just to very quickly, just add that, I mean, based on these priority actions, just to say that we are, working with CHAI, Gavi, and others to address these priority actions. For example, Phil has just mentioned about the advocacy. So as we speak right now, so we are rolling out an advocacy program targeting member states. And then on the regulatory side, I think Farah, in the last a few weeks ago, there was meetings between ourselves, WHO, AVMI, to address some of these challenges. And on the finance side, we also work in discussions with DFIs to identify or package products that match the needs of manufacturers. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Wesley.
So, may I go ahead, William? Thank you. So I think firstly, I keep saying to anybody that listens, I'm the biggest advocate for the work that Africa CDC, together with PATH, CHAI, and our independent consultant, have done, because I think it provides a level of clarity. And indeed, I think it's very differentiated from what we have in terms of the full pharma landscape for Africa. I think vaccines, we have a high level of clarity and visibility, thanks largely to this work. So I just want to give that continued feedback, because I think it's really critical. Having said that, I think there's a huge responsibility with what we are putting forward and putting out into the global community in terms of these key messages. And so perhaps my reflections are around that, and some of the sort of, I'm not going to call it negative messaging, but I think a lot of what this work is trying to do is trying to caution against overcapacitating the continent, trying to caution towards more strategic thought into new ventures in the vaccine space because of the risk of overcapacitation, etc. But I think we also have to acknowledge the responsibility of the owners of this work towards not creating further challenges for those that are already in progress and still seeking funding. And so a lot of this, could be potentially maybe not viewed favorably. So let me give some examples. I think the first thing is Okay, so firstly, I think 4 key comments or questions. The one is, we present a lot of the challenges on funding, and Wesley, you just jumped in with some of the work that's happening, but I think you need to present that balance, right? Because we all know the challenges. The question is, what are we doing together as Africa CDC and all the global community to address some of these challenges? And we're just not getting to that. And so we have this AfricSim and African Development Bank, these big announcements in terms of funding. And until today, perhaps I'm out of touch, but until today, we've not yet got clear visibility of those instruments which could provide a solution to some of these challenges. So I think, Wesley, the message back to Africa CDC is you had just intervened with some of the work that's happening, but there needs to be visibility when we present this picture, because now it's very one-sided, right? So that's just on the funding piece, I think is a very key concern. I think a suggestion to the Pathchai Kris team is it might be useful now to have the next cut. So 2030 to 2035, what are those antigens and countries expected? So we've got the 25 to 2030, would be good to see the longer range picture. One, to give some confidence and credibility to the others beyond sort of South Africa and Egypt. Two, to put pressure for the regulatory accelerations in those areas. And so I think if we could get that second cut, it also then talks to the full AVMI timeline, which would be helpful, right? So that's a second sort of suggestion. The third is, I think, similar to the funding, I think, Wesley, what we really, really need in this particular deck, i.e. when you're sending this information that's captured here, I think it's very, very important to have one slide that provides some granularity on the plans with engagement for member states for PPM. I think, again, as with the funding, it's still very high level. It's a one sentence. But for funders and for other key global stakeholders in the global community, they do need to get a sense of what we are doing on the continent in terms of the engagement, advocacy, champions for local manufacturing, etc. So I think that this deck needs that color, because otherwise it remains quite light on what is it that we actually think this could be successful, right? On what basis? We're not getting any sort of visibility of the other side of the coin. And I think including that, there's also the piece on UNICEF, right? We're hearing that UNICEF in conversation is starting to warm up to potentially stating commitment of volumes procured. And so that information would also need to come out here. Now, if we speak to UNICEF now, they're saying they're busy working on it, but it's a far cry from where they were months ago saying there would be nothing. And so I guess the messaging I'm leaving here, guys, is that we're seeing one side and we're not really seeing the full picture. And so when you put this in front of a funder or something, it becomes rather alarmist versus a comprehensive picture of the challenges plus the sort of opportunities, right? And then I guess my last sort of clear question is, can we go to slide 15? Because I'm very unsure as to how, out of an addressable market of 830, we've arrived at 17%. And secondly, just explain to me, what is this 1.470 again? What is that portion of the 2.6? So just on this slide, I'd like to understand more, because Phil, the messaging here is that if I were a funder, why would I even bother investing if only likely 145 million doses would come to the African manufacturers of these sort of 8 antigens, if that's how I'm reading it properly. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, let me do the detailed question before coming back to some of these other questions, maybe. So on the 830, so yeah, these are for the 8 markets which have products coming, which have near to market antigens. And so we've used kind of rough share allocations. So where a manufacturer is coming into a market with 2 existing players and it'll be a 3-player market, we've kind of allocated up to 30% of the market there. And so across these antigens, we end up allocating somewhere between 30, 25, 20%, depending on the number of players in the market, apart from markets in which there is kind of programmatic implications. So for PCV10, we haven't modeled switches of countries from PCV from 13 to PCV10, although that is an assumption that could be adapted, right? And the same for Rota going from a 3-dose to a 2-dose. So this is a representation of the initial kind of potential allocations. Obviously, we know that in UNICEF markets, someone like Serum can have 70% allocation in a market, but having that built up over time. But looking at a history of UNICEF allocations for a new manufacturer into the market, we've capped it at 30%, given our, our perspective on how that has been dealt with previously. Looking at the 1470, so yeah, this is for all of the antigens which are not in the near to market category. And so at the moment here, actually, there's kind of a lot of oral polio and stuff and vaccines of that nature. I mean, I think that part of the discussion is that apart from the 8 near-to-market antigens, and Kris showed the kind of breakdown of where tech transfers were happening, there aren't clear significant markets where there's a massive opportunity, right? And I would say that we have another version of this, which is 2030, which is a bit more optimistic, where malaria is a larger market, and I think that is a significant opportunity. So the potential markets here are malaria and HPV, where again there is an opportunity, and so that takes the number to around 50 million. But that's all of the antigens outside of the kind of 8 near to market areas. Yeah.
So Phil, thanks for that. I think before we just go to the other hands, if we could just close this question so that we don't have to come back here. So I think my ask is be cognizant of the message you're sending with this, right? It's not coming across as 30%. So in my mind, it's giving permission to UNICEF and others to sort of dilly around 15, 17, 20%. So if you were then going to keep this, then specify this excludes PCV, this excludes this, it's roughly 30% assumption, etc. But what it looks like now to anybody looking at this is that CHI's independent assessment is that we're getting 15, 17% of this market. Other ways of cutting this could be showing the 145 growing exponentially to 2030 and a little bit more detail on what's excluded out of there, etc. Because we are asking, and this is very important, we are asking UNICEF, we are asking member states to change their way from business as usual, whereas this is reflecting business as usual as if we just slide in sort of and given a couple of doses, etc. So it doesn't really come across as success, is my view on this. But thank you for that.
Yeah, okay, noted. And for sure, we want to make sure we're giving a balanced perspective. So yeah, that's the ambition here. Should we do your questions first before doing the other hands, or?
No, I think if you've noted the questions, let's go through some round of hands and then you can address them all. Thanks, Paul.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, I might jump in because it's a nice segue from Farah's last comments. I'm in a militant frame of mind, and one of my favourite sayings is, if you keep doing the same thing, you'll keep getting the same result, which I think is what Farah was saying. And slide 15 was problematic for me because my interpretation of it is that African manufacturers are not getting enough access to the demand for supply on the continent, which is the way I see it. And I think, many of the colleagues on the call will see it, because we're trying to achieve an objective where Africa, or the African continent, is addressing its health security and its health sovereignty. So just doing the same thing and understanding that the current opportunity is limited is not helping address that problem. So I would flip the whole thing and say, what needs to happen in order for African manufacturers to have greater access to meet those overarching objectives? So I totally agree with Farah around kind of reframing. And I have the same issue on the regulatory front. So on the regulatory front, yes, we can put a lot of energy and effort into the WHO PQ dossiers and work is ongoing to support that. But I do think that sort of talking about 300 days or, that's 300 working days is, again, we're just doing the same thing. Okay, we might be doing it a little bit more efficiently, but what needs to happen in order for those 8 antigens to be on the table more quickly, and not just following the current framework? What would need to happen? Now, we have a blueprint because we did all of that for COVID. So this is another global health challenge. Why can't we find a way of addressing that? And look, I think for they would be my overarching comments, because I think what we need to do is, from this data, which is fantastic, and from this analysis, which is insightful, what do we do about it to get there faster and with more African representation? And opening up another area, for me, this screams of some form of African pool procurement, where the continent has control not only of its manufacturing, but it also has control of the demand. Thank you.
All right, I'll jump in because I'm the only hand left, I guess. No, I think Farah and Lisa, your comments are very helpful, and I think slide 15 in particular is quite divisive. I think depending on who we show that slide to, we get one strong feeling one direction versus another. And I think what we're attempting to do with this is show our understanding of the current situation, to invite conversation, to have this no longer be, well, to work towards it not being such a divisive topic, but one that we can at least find balance around. So I know you're not shooting the messenger, so to speak, but I think, for me, this just points to the need for us to have more dialogue around those key topics with a wider group of people and see how we can come to greater alignment.
But then, Kris, I think if you're going to do that, and it's going to be purely for the purpose of this conversation, which could be divisive, please acknowledge who you are sharing this with and what message it leaves. So therefore, if this is the way it's going to be, then frame it as such and include your assumptions, which can be stress tested. But when we leave a number like 145 out of 830, it talks to 15% being allocated. It's a why would anybody invest in any of the current 8? Remember, these 8 antigens that we've listed still need to happen. They still need support from various stakeholders to happen. And the risk of this is that in ensuring that we don't overcapacitate the continent, we actually shut down the ones that are in progress. And so I just want you guys to be mindful of who this is going to land with. And therefore, even if you're not going to change it, maybe include your assumptions and list some of the sort of, I don't know, it is, do you know what I mean, right? Because it is alarming if you read it like this, right? Then I just say shut shop to half of the 8 antigens.
Yeah, I think we tried to list the assumptions, but we can maybe bring that into that slide as well, and we can caveat it. I mean, as Kris said, this does get divisive opinions. It has been shown to the kind of UNICEF, Gavi, global partners in some detail, and sometimes our reaction is, wow, that number is higher than I expected in 2030, and then we also get the reaction that, well, this is much lower than is what we need. So there is reaction on both sides, and I think it's an important discussion, and it's good to, this is the first time that I think a number is being put down on the table, and I think it's important to start having that discussion as soon as possible. And there is a need to hash it out a little bit and work out what a reasonable target would look like.
So maybe, Phil, just to close on that, when you do go and rewrite or redo or add or edit the slide, which I'm hoping you will, can you also then maybe put, as Lisa said, This is if we continue as business as usual without interventions of a share allocation from UNICEF, without any other interventions. This is what it would look like if we thought these competitors entered in the current competitive landscape, et cetera, whatever the wording is, right? But it needs to then come across as a current state and not a desired state.
Yeah, and that is exactly right. So we've used the word hypothetical demand allocation, but we can make a more descriptive term for the analysis. Kris.
Well, I'd even ask, what is the right venue or means to have a broader discussion on this?
Well, I've always got offers of thoughts around things like this.
That's why I'm asking.
I would get Africa CDC, UNICEF, and Gavi around the table with AVMI, and I would have this robust debate, because it doesn't help if we don't hear that they are pushing you south of that number in other meetings. So we need to then get to the sort of outcomes of, okay, Leila, can you then come by December with a number? Give us a number of what you're going to allocate for these 8 antigens. Remember, what they've told us is they can't say 30%, but what they can say is, let's look at the addressable market for these 8 antigens. So actually the 830, and they can then say, out of the 830, we are looking at this target in the beginning, and this target in the middle, and this target by 2030. And we'll give ourselves a stretch target as well. So those then, once we get into that conversation, we can start having this discussion and debate without shooting the messenger, as you say, Kris.
So I have a quick comment. I have a quick comment here for Wesley. Wesley, with all these discussions about the numbers, how does this bode for the Africa pool procurement policy? Because some major drastic action by an Africa PPM could change this, doesn't it? Over.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe just before I respond to Prof, so I just wanted to say the comments from AVMI are well taken. I think especially also from Lisa, especially that we don't want to look at it the traditional way, but we need to also convey a message that says there has to be a shift in thinking. So well noted. And then Farah, on the issue of finance, yes, I mean the Africa Exim Bank made a the announcement, but just to update you that now they are working, or they have reached out to us, and we are working very closely with them on breaking down the 2 billion into more specific details. So there is some work ongoing on that. And back to Prof's question, yes, I mean for the APPM, maybe just to say that yes, the whole purpose of APPM was to promote the demand consolidation, and I think the trajectory still remains the same, despite I mean these numbers and analysis. It remains the same because the landscape is that looking at the future, quite a number of countries are graduating from this support from Gavi and others, so it provides the leeway. So it remains the same despite this work. We remain focused on the setting up the pool procurement mechanism, not initially not only for vaccines but also other non-vaccines, and then bringing in vaccines as appropriate, antigens as appropriate. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Wesley. I was thinking that maybe this kind of information that we've just had and the stark reality as has been presented, as Lisa mentioned, perhaps putting some fire into the Africa PPM and moving things in a more, I don't want to say radical way, but more rhetoric, that advocacy to show that we really need to change the status quo is what I'm talking about. So thank you very much for that. Are there any other burning comments? We need to bring this to a close. We'd like to thank Kris and Phil for the wonderful work and the support from Africa CDC, CHI, BGMF, and all the partners who supported this week. Is there anybody who's raised his hand that I haven't seen who needs to make a comment or a question, and then we can close? Over.
No hands, William. So thank you, everybody. And again, final message. Let's understand the gravitas of landing this with global stakeholders and the implications to the manufacturers already in progress, right? But thanks so much to all of you, and please do circulate the deck to AVMI, and then we will circulate to members and non-members alike. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.